This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with an episode of their podcast, Fins, Fur, and Feathers. This week, the pair discusses prairie dogs in Kansas and their impact. An interview about animals people are often averse to continues the show. Drew Ricketts, K-State wildlife specialist, shares some interesting details about critters in Kansas. Completing today's show is this week's Milk Lines. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk looks at how the dairy industry has made tremendous progress in its reproductive efficiency using an application called the pregnancy rate. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with Fins, Furs, and Feathers from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Well, welcome back to Fins, Fur, and Feathers. We're excited to chat a little bit more in depth today, and you brought with us today, you're going to chat about prairie dogs a little bit. Maybe we can jump into a little bit about them and talk about them as a species, and then maybe jump into some of the positives and negatives they might have.
Sure. So specifically today we'll talk about black-tailed prairie dogs. They're the most widely distributed prairie dog species in North America. They're currently occupying about 1 to 2 million acres in the U.S., which is about 2% of their historic range. So they have declined a lot, and some of those declines are associated with rangeland being tilled for row crop agriculture, and others of those declines are associated with control for cattle production. They are a colonial ground squirrel. They're about a foot tall. They weigh about 1 to 3 pounds. They live 2 to 4 years. They're mostly active during the daytime. They burrow, can occupy 1 to multiple burrows, and 5 to more than 20 prairie dogs per acre, so they can be pretty dense sometimes.
Now down to quite a little bit of their historic range. So in this range they're in, what are they doing on a daily basis?
So they're mainly diurnal. Prairie dogs eat lots of grasses and forbs. They can have up to 90% overlap with cattle and sheep. During the times of year when there's not green vegetation available, they do eat some seeds and some insects as well, but they're trying to make up the bulk of their diet from green growing vegetation when that's available to them.
Are they eating the entire plant, or are they just eating the seed heads? What do they generally do there?
There's 2 things that they do. So when they're feeding, they're going to eat most of the green parts of the plant, but they also want to be able to see so that they can avoid predators on their town. And the combination of their feeding activity and how they clip the vegetation makes them what we would call a keystone species. So that's a big term that biologists or ecologists like to use, and it's basically how we refer to a species that has a greater than expected impact on the environment and also on other critters that might occupy the environment. So their burrows provide homes to lots of species. That cropped off vegetation, the really short grass that's available out there, also provides habitat to other critters. So prairie dog towns are really important for species like mountain plovers. Another bird species would be the burrowing owl, rattlesnakes, jackrabbits, cottontail rabbits, swift fox. Also the black-footed ferrets basically doesn't exist without prairie dog colonies to live in. So it's really important from an ecological standpoint, but the things that make it really important also make it a challenge for cattle producers. And there's one really good study that's quantified the impact that can have on a cattle producer, and that was a study out of eastern Colorado. They were using stocker cattle. They had pastures that had up to 60% prairie dog occupancy, and they compared gains of the cattle in those pastures versus gains in pastures that didn't have any prairie dogs in them at all. And so they got a really good picture of the impact that prairie dogs can have on cattle producers. And averaged across the 10 years, the cost of prairie dogs was about 23 pounds per stalker, which at current market conditions is about $37 per head. Another study found that at 20% occupancy, prairie dogs cost about 5% in total gains, and at 60%, prairie dogs cost about 14% in total gain. So that shows that some control can help increase production or offset those losses.
What are some ways that we might control these prairie dogs?
One of the options that folks talk about a lot is shooting. And shooting can be an effective method of control. It's also a really good method that some folks have used to offset the cost of prairie dogs. So some producers will lease hunting rights for prairie dogs to individual hunters. Some producers will also lease hunting rights to outfitters. So that is sort of adding some recreational value to this species to try and offset some of those economic losses for the cattle producers. That sort of shooting is typically not an effective control method. For shooting to be an effective control method, it has to be done very strategically. It's typically done around the borders of a colony to try and make that border area seem not safe and try and keep the prairie dogs from expanding. The other place where shooting can be pretty effective, and this is sort of an anecdote that you're not going to find in the literature, but it's something that I picked up from some folks that do prairie dog control for a living, is the toxicants that we use for prairie dog control have specific times of the year when they can be used. And when we treat with those toxicants during the season that they can be used under label, we have this other period of the year when we might need to do some control, but we can't use the toxicants. And shooting, and very strategic shooting as a follow-up to that chemical control, can be an effective control method. So specifically talking about our chemical control options, we have basically 3 types of toxicants, and then we also have fumigants. So we'll talk about the toxicants because they're the most widely used. So there's 3 main active ingredients: chlorphacinone and diphacinone and zinc phosphide. So chlorphacinone and diphacinone are both first-generation anticoagulants. They work similarly to the way that warfarin does. So, that's a drug that people will use as a blood thinner. So that's what they do, is they thin the blood. These are labeled for rangelands and associated non-croplands. So one of the really important things when we're thinking about pesticides is that each state is going to be a little bit different in what can be used, what is going to be labeled for control for different species and that sort of thing. So if you're outside of Kansas and you're listening to this and you might be controlling some prairie dogs, make sure you're checking your labels and you're using the appropriate toxicants or thinking about the appropriate pesticides to use in your state. So in Kansas, we're talking about October 1st to March 15th as the period of time when chlorphacinone and diphacinone products can be used in those rangelands and like road ditches that might be next to them and that sort of thing. And then zinc phosphide is an acute toxicant, so it works very differently than chlorphacinone or diphacinone. They are a slow buildup that then causes that animal to hemorrhage and die a few days after it's ingested a lethal dose. Whereas zinc phosphide, they eat that toxicant, there's a chemical reaction that happens in the gut, and that animal dies immediately. Zinc phosphide oats are labeled only for rangelands and associated non-croplands, and the period that they're open for use is from July 1 to January 1st, so it's a little different label period.
How well do these toxicants work, Drew?
The 2 anticoagulants, chlorphacinone and diphacinone, the studies that have been done in Kansas and eastern Colorado have shown that they can be 70 to 100% effective, whereas the zinc phosphide oats, we're seeing more like 50 to 85% control in Kansas. That's a different number that has been reported in some other places where they do prairie dog control, but there's been several studies that have looked at that, and they've found the zinc phosphide to be less effective in our area. And then the other thing to think about is these toxicants are really going to be most effective during the time when green vegetation is not available. And to make them even more effective, if somebody's wanting to get really good control on their property, if we've got a bad weather event coming in where we might have snow on the ground for a long period of time and that sort of thing, then prairie dogs are going to really capitalize on those oats that are carrying the active ingredient that we're wanting them to ingest. And so that's when you get really the most effective control with these products.
You talked a little bit about chemicals. I've heard about fumigating. Is that something they do with prairie dogs? Maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
It is. So fumigation is another option. We try and limit the application of fumigants in Kansas because when we use a fumigant, we're applying it down into the burrow system, and it's going to be a poisonous gas that kills anything that's down in the burrow. So we're not just killing prairie dogs, we're also killing any mice or snakes or lizards or birds or even down to insects that might be in there. And so you do have to have a special permit to use fumigants in Kansas. It's called a Prairie Dog Control Permit. You apply for that through your extension office, and then it's something that I'm going to evaluate. And so I'm going to be looking at things like how big of a town are you wanting to fumigate? If it's in rangeland, how come you haven't used the toxicants? Or is this a follow-up treatment? You've used toxicants and now you're trying to use aluminum phosphide or magnesium phosphide or poisonous gas cartridges, which are those fumigants, outside of the label period for the toxicants. That might be an appropriate application on a small enough scale. The other place where these are used fairly frequently are when we have prairie dog towns that are in a city, because we can't apply those toxicants there. We also can't shoot them. Trapping may not be an option. That is an option for small scale removal of prairie dogs out in croplands, or let's say we had some in a fairground or something like that. We can use some lethal like body gripping traps and that sort of thing. So fumigants are an option, but we try to limit their use because they are so toxic to everything that's exposed to them.
That was K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken on their new podcast, Fins, Fur, and Feathers, that will be airing on Ag Today twice a month. I will put a link in today's show notes on agtoday.net if you'd like to go look more into their podcast. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show on this Halloween discussing some creatures that people are often averse to. And to talk about it, we're joined by K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shelby. I'm looking forward to this. I think it's going to be fun.
Quite a few different animals for us to talk about, and the first one being raccoons.
Raccoons are an interesting species. They're distributed throughout all of Kansas, of course, and really most of North America. People see lots of raccoons around, and I think one of the fun things to talk about for us that fits well with Halloween might be some of the diseases that raccoons can carry, because that's not something everybody thinks about all the time. One of those diseases is canine distemper virus, and it tends to be when raccoon populations get relatively high, we start to see a fair number of raccoons dying, and that's one of the main diseases that tends to be common in that sort of situation. I mean, that one is a concern because it can be passed on to our pets and that sort of thing. The really kind of nasty one that's a little bit more fun to talk about and think about for Halloween is actually a parasite. So it's the raccoon roundworm. And the raccoon roundworm, when it's in raccoons, just acts like a normal roundworm that many critters would have. It stays in their intestines. But then the raccoons end up shedding eggs from those roundworms in their feces. And sometimes a human ends up ingesting one of those eggs. And when that happens, the egg ends up hatching in our digestive tract. And then they do something called larval migrans, which means that after that egg hatches, the larva perforates the intestinal wall and then moves through the body until it settles somewhere while it develops. And sort of the best case scenario is that one of those larvae will settle in your eye, and then it matures in your eye and it sprouts out of your eyeball when it's an adult and you go blind. The worst case scenario is that one of these larvae will settle in your brain and then mature in your brain, and you end up going crazy and dying. So that's a pretty bad deal. Thankfully, there have not been very many cases of this. The last time I checked, it was less than 100 in the U.S., but it is something that's pretty nasty.
And then another little creature that people might not be a fan of, rats and mice.
Yeah, rats and mice are another interesting group of critters. And if we collectively think about all the different species of rats and mice, there's going to be somewhere between 10 and 24, depending on what you consider a rat and a mouse. Most of those species are native to Kansas. We do have a couple of introduced species, and those are going to be the more common species that are in houses, especially in urban areas and that sort of thing. So that would be the house mouse and the Norway rat. And those actually came from Europe or maybe even Africa on boats when North America or even just the New World period got colonized.
And next, Drew, making the distinction that there is a difference between possums and opossums.
There is, yeah. So opossums are the critter that we have in the New World. There's several species if you go on down into South America and Central America, but we actually have opossums here, and they're a marsupial, so they've got a pouch where their underdeveloped young develop after they're born. Possums, which is what most people in Kansas call opossums, are actually in the Old World. So Australia and New Zealand, that is one of the marsupials that they have down there.
For controlling opossums, or maybe not seeing them hopefully in your area, what are a few things for them?
Really the same things that we think about with raccoons and skunks. Limiting access to underneath buildings, not having piles of brush, limiting food access in the yard, keeping our trash cleaned up, all that kind of thing.
And now talking about some critters that are even more for Halloween, bats.
Yeah, bats are one of those groups of critters that lots of people have a really strong aversion to, and some of that's well-founded and some of it's not. There's 14 species of bats in Kansas. There's a couple more that people have recorded here, but they're questionable, so we say 14 instead of 16. Several of those are actually of conservation concern. They all are insectivorous, so they eat bugs. We don't have any fruit bats in Kansas, and we also don't have any sanguinivorous bats in Kansas, which is what we would call something that eats blood. So no vampire bats up here.
And there are a few things for people maybe to think about if they do find one in their living space.
Yeah, so the main concern if we have a bat in the living space that's really important is to think about rabies. And so the question that needs to be asked if there is a bat in a living space is, can everybody answer the question, did that bat land on me, or was that bat on me at any point? Can everybody answer that question a definitive no? If that question cannot be answered either because somebody was asleep with the bat in the room, or if the person is too young to communicate or can't communicate well for another reason, then we need to submit that bat for testing for rabies, because their mouths are so small and their claws are so small that that bat could have landed on you, it could have bitten you or scratched you, and you might not know it. And so that bat should be submitted through a process of going through your local health department, and then it will end up at the rabies diagnostic lab here at K-State. If we can't submit that bat for testing for some reason, then we also need to reach out to the health department, and then most likely you're going to end up needing to seek post-exposure rabies treatment. Bats are not the most common species in Kansas to carry rabies. Skunks are, but because of the challenge that we have with knowing if they've bitten us or not, it's really important. And it's so important because once you're symptomatic of rabies, it's 100% fatal. And so it's not worth that risk.
And another Halloween animal to talk about, cats, but specifically talking about mountain lions.
Yeah, so mountain lions for me and the normal work that I do are kind of the ultimate boogeyman that affects people in Kansas. And, you know, a boogeyman is something I think that we're scared of, but it may or may not be around a lot of the time. And the interesting thing about mountain lions is that most of the individuals that are in Kansas are dispersing from other populations. The ones that we've either gotten our hands on or that we've got good photographic or video evidence of the parts that we need to be able to see have been males. These are dispersing from populations to the north and west of us or to the west of us that have recovered typically. And they're moving through the state on these big movements to try and find a home. And what they're looking for is good habitat with a female in it. And when they don't find that, they just keep on moving. We do not have a breeding population of mountain lions in Kansas, but we do have those dispersing individuals. And that has resulted in 61 confirmed detections since 2005. As we talk about this, the most recent of those was just in Parsons, and that was a cat that ended up getting caught on surveillance video sort of on the northeast edge of town there. Of those 61 confirmed detections, there were only 22 confirmed before the year 2020. The most in a year was 15 in 2022, and we're currently sitting at 9 in 2023, including that individual that was recently caught on Kansas and Parsons.
And for those mountain lions, more likely to impact raccoons than humans?
Yeah, that's kind of a fun fact about mountain lions. Especially these younger individuals that are making these dispersal movements, they're not all that good hunters yet. And so raccoons are a very common prey item for them. In areas with porcupines, that would be another common prey item. They're not good enough predators that they're really killing a lot of deer and that sort of thing. But we see a lot of pictures of mountain lions at deer feeders. And one of the reasons for that is because there's a lot of trail cameras on deer feeders. But the other reason is that the mountain lions are probably using those for a place to hunt. And sometimes we actually get pictures of mountain lions at deer feeders with a raccoon in their mouth. So we document that.
Drew, our last animal to talk about for today is coyotes.
Coyotes, yeah. So coyotes, we've talked a lot about coyotes and different aspects of problems associated with them and their ecology on the radio programs. But I think one thing that fits really well with Halloween is their vocalizations. So we hear coyotes howling and barking and those sorts of things at night. And they make those vocalizations for a lot of different reasons. The broad overarching reason is communication with other coyotes. And then within that, they're communicating with members of their family group. We have lots of different kinds of howls, a lone howl or a group howl, which the group howls where it sounds like there's a whole bunch of coyotes in one spot or one small area that are making lots of racket. If you look a coyote group howl up on YouTube, you might see that there's many fewer coyotes making all those vocalizations than you really think they are. But those vocalizations serve to also tell other coyotes where they're at. Coyotes will fight to defend their territory, but they don't want to get in those conflicts if they don't have to. And so by vocalizing, they're letting not only their family group, but the other coyotes who are unrelated know this is our territory. This is where we hang out. And then a neighboring pack or family group might sound off. And so that's a way that they can see where all the different family groups are on the landscape so they can avoid actually physically interacting and maybe getting into a fight.
And Drew, is there an ability to control coyotes if they become an issue?
There is, for sure. So we don't have a closed season on coyotes. There are few restrictions on how coyotes can be taken. Most are either trapped or hunted. And if a producer is having a problem with coyotes killing livestock and that sort of thing, I really encourage them to reach out either to their local extension agent or even directly to me, because that's one of the main things I do is help folks who are having coyote problems. I'll come teach you how to take care of that problem yourself or connect you to other resources that can help you get that taken care of.
That was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. I would like to let you know that this interview was recorded on October 17th, so the most recent mountain lion sighting has changed since then. We're cutting to a short break on agriculture today, but we'll be back with more ahead.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. In the last 15 years, the dairy industry has made tremendous progress in its reproductive efficiency. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk takes a look at what's been so successful over the past 15 years.
Today, I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the reproductive programs on your dairy farms. I've really been amazed in the last 15 years the progress that we have made in reproductive efficiency across our industry, not just here in Kansas, but really across the United States. One of the key things that really helped us gain improvement on our reproductive programs, I think, is the application of something that we call pregnancy rate. We break the herd down into 21-day periods, and we divide the number of pregnancies by the number of animals that were eligible for breeding during that same 21-day period. As we focus more closely on something other than conception rate, we are actually able to move our efficiency numbers forward in leaps and bounds. So we use lots of different techniques to get cows to come into heat, and we use lots of different techniques to detect whether or not they're in heat and make sure that we are inseminating at the proper time. And all of those have been part of increasing our reproductive efficiency on our dairy. So as I look at numbers today compared to, say, 15 years ago, 15 years ago, preg rates on a lot of our dairies were barely 20. And today, as we look at numbers coming in from those herds that are doing an excellent job, we're actually seeing herds that are either approaching 40 or exceeding 40 on preg rate. Now, there's probably some tricks to making sure that you have a higher number rather than a lower number. And one of the things that I often visit with producers about is when we're determining pregnancy rates, it's really important that we understand what the voluntary waiting period is on our dairy. And we get into that discussion, that's the number of days we wait until we would actually inseminate an animal. Well, when we get into that discussion, there's a lot of variation across our dairies as to when would we actually put semen into an animal. For some dairies, it's by 60 days in milk or maybe by 70 days in milk, particularly if they're on some sort of reproductive management program. However, there may be a few animals that we put semen into a little bit earlier because they show us a good, strong heat. And we will take a chance that we will go ahead and do a breeding there, particularly if we've noticed a heat in a previous cycle on that animal. So what number do you use for your volunteer waiting period? Because that's going to really impact the size of the breeding herd. What I encourage our farms to do, if you are doing a little bit of cherry picking and breeding a few animals early, I wouldn't necessarily put in that earliest date that we might put semen into a cow. I would put in the date that we generally target to put semen into a cow. Now, if we generally start moving that date back on a higher percentage of our animals, probably need to make an adjustment there just to be fair to make sure that we're accurately portraying what's going on in terms of the size of the breeding herd. Other than that, it's really a matter of just making sure that we get semen into cows, the first service, on the date that we intended to. And then secondly, that we do pregnancy determination as soon as possible. So those animals that are still open can be re-enrolled into some sort of program to make sure that we get a second service into those animals as quickly as possible. Really, these two things are the things that probably drive our success in increasing the pregnancy rate on our dairies. And as we move forward, it's important that we continue to focus on these things, as getting these animals pregnant on time is really important to when they will calve in the next time and the length of our overall lactations. And as we increase pregnancy rate, we generally will reduce the number of days in milk that we have in a lactation and do a better job of controlling the number of days dry. This will make our herd overall more efficient and improve our financial position on our dairies. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.